Terry. I hope we can see that. All right, I'll assume that's a yes. Anyway, I'm going to start off just a very quick introduction here. This is some work I've been doing with Hannah Davies and João Duarte in Lisbon and Matthias Green up in Bangor in Wales, looking at future supercontinent reconstructions, or constructions, and not reconstructions, obviously, that Hannah and her collaborators have been doing over the last couple of years, and what the climatic effects of those reconstructions are. So I'll let Hannah talk first about those reconstructions, so she can talk in a language that most people on here will be familiar with, and I'll try to keep things simple from the climate perspective when I talk about what we've modeled there. So Hannah, take it away.
I'll try to make up the time. So essentially, this was the first kind of project of my PhD, was to reconstruct supercontinents of the future, so the next supercontinent. And so we chose two of the four that the Michael's, in the abstract, Michael actually referenced the four, if anybody's curious, Davis 2018. So this is the first one we chose, was Orica, and we chose this one because it's a very equatorial supercontinent. So essentially, this is what João Duarte's prediction of the future is going to be. So essentially, the Atlantic and the Pacific both close to form the next supercontinent around the Americas. And as you can see, this is a very equatorially concentrated supercontinent. So we're curious about, even more so than Pangaea, so we were curious about how that affects the climate. So then there was a second supercontinent that we looked at. If you could move to the next slide, please, Michael, which is the Amasia supercontinent. So essentially, this is the complete opposite. It's a very polar supercontinent, and the motivation for this scenario is that there's a remnant ring of subduction left by Pangaea, and that essentially confers a bias of drift towards that ring of subduction by modern continents. So all of the continents coalesce on the North Pole, and they leave Antarctica as kind of a rogue continent on the South Pole. And obviously you can see there's a lot of land mass concentrated on the poles, which could also affect the climate quite significantly. So we took both of these supercontinent scenarios at the end members of both, and we did three variations of the landmass. So the first variation is, if you could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, okay, there you go. So the first variation is essentially what we thought would be a very old supercontinent. So essentially, if the supercontinent had essentially eroded away, so there's no more major topographic features, you only have low mean topography close to sea level. So between 100 and 200 meters of topographic height. And we did this by just applying a random mask onto the continent. So every pixel on the continent mask is between 1 and 200 meters. And then next we chose more present day equivalent. So this one. So essentially this is the same thing. We applied a random mask onto the continent with topography, which is standard deviation and mean of present day. So essentially the sea level, the topography is between 1 and 4,000 meters. So there's no mountains per se, but there is elevation differences. And as you can see, there's kind of like a fuzz, which is where the elevation changes randomly. And then finally, we went for a more somewhat realistic, which is where we have a base mask. So the land is between 1 and 200 meters, low topography. And we added three types of mountains. So we added a Himalaya type mountain, which is less than 7,500 meters. And this is obviously, these mountains form in the same way the Himalayas do. So this is orogenic mountain building, so the largest mountains. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of mountains formed during this. There's a lot of mountains formed as the supercontinent comes together. There's a lot of orogenic events. So you have a large amount of these mountain chains, especially in the Orica scenarios, all the continents kind of mush together. And then we had Andes type mountains. So these are less than 4,000 meters. And essentially these are mountains that form at the edges of continents where subduction zones are. So it's essentially the Andes in South America. And the subduction zones are mostly focused along the coastlines. So obviously the Andes mountains are focused on the coastlines too. But a supercontinent will have enhanced subduction because you need more ocean recycling because there's less coastline. So the Andes Mountains are quite large as well. They're quite extensive. And then finally, we included Appalachian mountains. So essentially, these are the eroded remains of present day or mountains that formed just after the present day. So the best example is, if you can see on the major scenario on the right-hand side, where Africa has collided with Europe, that's formed a large mountain chain, which was then eroded away because that collision occurred not long from the present, actually. And it's probably going to happen in maybe 20 or 30 million years into the future. So that's eroded away. And those are the three mountains I actually went with. And then we ran Rocky 3D on all three. So I'll pass over to Michael to explain the details of Rocky 3D.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So I'll just briefly run over what the model is and what we put into the model and show you some pictures of that. So this is a general circulation model. It's derived from an Earth planet model that participates in things like the IPCC and CMIP, known as Model E, that's been developed at our institute for the last 35 years. We tend, in the planetary side of the group, which is where this model is derived and working, we tend to run at lower resolutions because we can get more work done. So you can see here, it's a 4x5 lat long grid we typically run at with a 40-layer atmosphere and a 13-layer fully coupled ocean. For these simulations, of course, we kept obliquity and eccentricity at modern values. We lengthened the day to 24.45 hours per day, because that's what we predict it will be 250 million years into the future. It's not quite a modern Earth, so we set the land albedo at 0.2 at model start. There's no land ice at model start, and we use a fixed clay sand soil type 50-50. We use a 1 bar atmosphere, basically modern pre-industrial, but there's no ozone and there's no aerosols in any of the simulations shown here, including the ones that I will call modern Earth. For the insolation, meaning how much of incident flux do these simulations receive at 200 million years into the future, for this Amasia simulation, we're using about 2% more, so we're at 1391 versus 1361. And for Orica at 250 million years, we're talking about, again, around 2% at 1396 watts per meter squared. So not greatly different from today, but you'll see there might be some differences. So the first thing we have to do is take Hannah's reconstructions that were at 1/4 degree by 1/4 degree and downsample those to 4 by 5 degrees. So these are those same reconstructions you saw before. So I put the modern continental map, the outlines up, and then you can see the blocking nature of the 4 by 5 here. And you can see that they're not greatly different, at least is how they look in the sampling. I'll focus a bit more on this Amasia run in particular, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Amasia simulations because I think they're a bit more interesting because the climate dynamics are quite unique for these in particular. So if you look at the first Amasia run, this control run where it's roughly sea level and no mountains, you can see where things stand. You can see that at Antarctica, we've got quite a lot of coverage of land, and at the North Pole, you can see there's quite a lot of open areas of large lakes and small oceans, as you like to call them. You can see in the downsampled present-day reconstruction, as we call it, that there's very little open ocean or land in the northern hemisphere near the Northern Pole. So it's quite distinct from the other one, which is again this mountainous one, which again has some quite a bit more open lakes and seas in the northern hemisphere, which will play a big role in the climate dynamics. So just give you a feel for the topography. Here's the hypsometry for Earth on the top. I've cut it off on the right at 2,000 meters, and you can see for the Amasia Rand control run, that sea level run, you can see that most of the height is fairly low. You can see for the present day that the mean is around 800 meters when you do this sampling average. And then for the mountainous one, you can see they're mostly fairly low again, because you mostly have mountain change, but the rest is fairly low elevation. So again, that middle run, that simulation 5, is the one that will have the kind of strange climate dynamics. And this is from the table in the paper which we have submitted to GRL. You can see for the Orica simulations that they all have roughly the same surface temperatures. That's this TC in column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Very simple surface temperatures. Their albedos, their planetary albedos are very similar, and the snow fraction, as I put here, for the planetary snow fraction percentage-wise, is fairly low. For the Amasya, you can see things are quite different now. First of all, you can see that the temperature variations between the three simulations, and in particular, number 5, is quite distinct, even from the Orica simulations. That's mostly because you have a lot of high latitude land, so you get a lot of snow deposition at the poles, and you see that in the snow fraction on the right and the planetary albedo. It's a little bit higher, but basically the snow fraction is what's making the difference. So you get this snow albedo feedback in the world. If you look at the bottom here, these are the Earth simulations, basically. So we use a control run, an Earth control run here with no aerosols and no O3. You can see that its temperature is around 14.2. If we just turn up the rotation to the same we've used for these other simulations, you can see that the temperature only changes by about 0.2 degrees. But the minute you increase the insolation, that should be no surprise to most of you here, you go up by a substantial amount, almost 3 degrees. This simulation is not quite done. These simulations do take a while to run. I expect it'll be around 17, 18 by the time it finishes, given what I see in the radiative balance for the simulation. So the increasing insolation is, of course, playing a major role, but that albedo feedback is going to show up again. So what I'm showing you here now is the snow and ice coverage for that Amasya, for the 3 Amasya runs. I'm showing you just December, January, February, so Northern Hemisphere winter. This is a 50-year average. The last 50 years of these runs, they usually run around 2,000 years to come into equilibrium. And you can see there's quite a lot of snow and ice coverage in the northern and southern hemispheres. If we go to that one which has much less lake and open seas in the northern hemisphere, you can see that there's a lot more snow and ice coverage in that simulation. And that again is that ice albedo feedback playing a role in driving the global surface temperature down. And then you can see again the third one, there's quite a bit less snow and ice coverage at the northern hemispheres. Now the question is what's causing this? So initially I thought it was probably going to be ocean circulation. So here's what the ocean circulation, the top layer of the ocean, what the velocities look like in terms of the heat distribution, and you can see that probably things don't look that different if you're used to looking at oceans from modern Earth. But the key points are up here in the northern hemisphere. You can see that the vectors are quite small, but there is ocean heat transport up in the north. If we look at that cooler one, you can see first of all that the landmass has shrunk a little bit, but you're getting more or less the same ocean heat transport. And then for that third simulation, the same thing, getting similar amounts, but again, you have a little bit more ocean at the north. So I think the ocean is transporting more heat into the north, and that is playing some role in keeping the amount of ice down in the winters, because you're getting this transport from the equator to the poles. And on Earth, of course, that plays quite a major role. But really, I think it's probably the elevation that's playing the big role. We're doing some additional simulations to try to prove that the elevation is indeed the key factor in what's driving this here. So just wrap up very quickly here. So for this Orica runs that Hannah mentioned, the mean surface temperatures, as I say, for all the simulations are within 0.1 degrees centigrade. That's sort of interesting, but that's because we don't have these high latitude supercontinent remnants. For the Amasya, as you saw here, the mean surface temperature span 3 degrees centigrade, and the lowest mean surface temperature of the 7.2 is really, due to these large contiguous ice sheets that we see in the northern hemisphere, and of course in Antarctica, which don't exist in the Orica simulations. I'm not sure that the oceans really can transport sufficient heat to heat those higher latitudes, as we see that in the ocean and the ice buildup, but in particular for that middle simulation. And I really think that's probably the higher elevations because of the reconstructions that are playing the key role in the climate dynamics. I did mention that it's insolation that's playing the key role, at least in our Earth control run, to drive the temperatures to quite distinct values they're approaching what we see in the Amasya simulations at 7.2. And for future work, we're going to work on putting some ice sheets into the model and then investigate lapse rate effects from the higher elevation ice sheets at the high latitudes. That's all I have to say. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm sure Hannah and I can try to answer them anyway.
Cool. Thanks very much, Michael and Hannah. That was